and Taunton for hosting us today. You've been gracious hosts, and we look forward to walking around and seeing and meeting all of you after the meeting. Today's agenda has two critical items for discussion and one vote that are in service of the department's goal to help support providers across the Commonwealth serve children and families in the most efficient way possible while continuing to support access, affordability, and quality. I do also want to acknowledge board members of Tanasoff and Lee that are participating today via phone. And I'll hand it over to the secretary for comments.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, all. And I'll first echo your thanks to the hosts for having us this afternoon. Look forward to meeting folks, certainly before we depart later on this afternoon. I'll keep my comments brief. First, as we know, tomorrow is a big day. From the standpoint of budget, we expect the House to release its version of the budget tomorrow afternoon. Of course, we'll dig into that right away, but I'll say today that we are hopeful and optimistic around the legislators' understanding of need in early education. And then lastly, also just want to lift up our great visit to a site in Lawrence that I believe a member on this board knows pretty well. In partnership with the commissioner and Governor Healy, this was an opportunity not only to bear witness to the great work happening on that site, but also an invitation an opportunity to hear more about innovation in the staffing space. We got to meet some incredible teachers and hear their story, but also learn details around the path that they took to become teachers or mentor teachers. And this is one of a number of innovative practices that I'm learning about that are showing real promise in the area of pipeline and also, I think we would agree, professionalizing this important work. That is all.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I'll hand it over to the Commissioner.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, Mr. Chairman. A few updates for the board. First of all, I want to thank Renee Collier, who's our Regional Director for Southeast Cape and the Islands, and your team for hosting us today in your beautiful space. And also calling out a great event that happened last week here that was collaboration from our CFCE grantees, our family child care licensors, and licensing team that are here. It was hosting an event for potential new family child care providers, recruiting among parents who had been interested and engaged. And we had 18 interested providers, I think, attend the event. And I think it's leading the way in us sort of really thinking about how we tap into the interest in the community. And we collaborate with our community partners to build new capacity and bring on new businesses in the community. So thank you for your leadership in that work as well. And I don't think Patty Watson is here from Cape Cod Children's Place, but I know she played a leadership role in helping to do that too. So thank you. The early education, higher education scholarship, as I mentioned last month, is now live and open and available. We administer that program in partnership with the Department of Higher Education. We're going to be hosting 2 informational sessions on April 12th at 6 p.m. and on April 27th at 7 p.m. Those will be in English and Spanish. And we are really pumping up our outreach on this program, hoping to increase opportunities for folks to enroll in higher education if that's their choice, and use the scholarship program. We'll be using social media. We'll also have updated our website with information about those outreach sessions and working with the Department of Higher Ed to make sure that those are listed on there. So please outreach to your communities and networks to know that scholarship program is out. The latest C3 survey is also out on the street, so to speak. We already have 4,400 responses, which is about 65% of participants, and we look forward to receiving more. That information has been essential for us in understanding the impact of the program and having really insight statewide into the experience of our early education and care program. So thanking those who have already participated and encouraging those who have not yet to get their responses in. Also related to C3, I sent an email, but wanted to also publicly acknowledge that the legislature filed and the governor signed a supplemental budget for FY23, which included $68 million for the C3 program, which will allow us to continue that program through the end of the fiscal year. And I think there was a giant sigh of relief when that happened across the Commonwealth and certainly at the agency. So we were thrilled with that action and want to thank our legislative colleagues as well as the administration for their support of this critical program. We are not presenting on it today, but wanted to give a quick update on all of our favorite program, which is the Early Educator Pilot, which is providing childcare financial assistance for our staff working in early education and care programs. We have now reached more than 1,500 children through that program. We have 500 enrolled with active access to childcare financial assistance. Another 500 who've been deemed eligible and are awaiting placement, and the rest are in process. We also have 217 new providers who have signed voucher agreements with us through that program. And those are providers who hadn't previously participated in the child care financial assistance system. So we look forward to continuing to update you on that. As the Secretary mentioned, we're expecting the House Ways and Means budget to be released tomorrow. We will keep you all updated on the status of the EC's budget and line items through that. And finally, just noting that the next 2 board meetings in May and June will be at 50 Milk Street, which is our Boston office. And then we will be off for the summer as we don't meet in July and August. And that's the end of my update.
Thank you, Commissioner, and just great highlights. And I do want to thank the Secretary and please extend gratitude to the Governor for signing the supplemental budget. I think we all heard that collective sigh of relief that the field needed in regards to fulfilling the commitment for the year. So just want to extend the gratitude for that. It doesn't appear that we have anyone in here for public comment, but I do want to acknowledge that the board has received public comment by email and it's been distributed just prior to the meeting. We have one item of routine business in front of us today. We have before us the minutes of the March board meeting. Are there any additions, corrections, or edits? If not, I'd make a motion to approve the minutes of the March board meeting. Can I have a second?
Second.
Carolyn, thank you for the second. I'll call the roll of the members. The members who are not present should abstain. Secretary Tutwiler.
Yes.
Maura Siegel.
Abstain.
Carolyn Kane.
Yes.
Maria Moeller.
Yes.
Nikki Ruiz.
Abstain.
Cheryl Travers.
Yes.
Jamela Lee.
Yes.
Georgia Tanasoff.
Yes.
Linda Sager.
Yes.
And now the motion is approved. Now I'll hand it over to the commissioner. I want to acknowledge that although it's beautiful out, many of us here are suffering from severe allergies. So if my voice makes it through this meeting, it'll be a miracle. But if anything, I'll be brief in all of my comments. But I do want to just name that and hand it over to the commissioner for the first agenda item.
It is the season. So I want to invite Janice DiLoretto-Smith and Joy Cohen to come up. We are very pleased today to be presenting a final set of revised regulations governing childcare financial assistance in the Commonwealth to the board for your consideration. As you know, we had an extensive public comment period, which resulted in those being better and stronger, we believe, as a result of the feedback and comments that we received. And we are pleased to present them today for your consideration and vote, and a move up to the Secretary of State's office for promulgation. And I'll turn it over to these 2 leaders who have helped shepherd the work along with a whole other team. And
Leaders who have helped shepherd the work along with a whole other team. And
we're on delay. Okay. That is not what I want to be hearing myself, but echoed back. But I think we have been joined by Steffi Curtin, so welcome. And these childcare financial assistance regulations really represent, as we've said to you over the months that we've been working on them. I don't know if a year ago we would have known we would have been here and ready for sending them for promulgation, but thanks to the hard work of the team and engagement of many of our advocates and members of our community, we are here. And these regulations, as technical as they are, really provide the foundation for the future state of where we want to be as an agency in terms of our experience and engagement with families. We want to be family-centered. We want to be respectful. We want them to have dignity in doing work with us. We want it to be modern. We want it to be transparent. And we want it to be easy to support our families on their economic mobility path. And I think
you've been muted. To unmute yourself, press *6.
I know you have heard a lot about the child care financial assistance regs already, so I will move on from there. So I'm for the new members of the board, I will ask both Joy and Janice to just do a quick review of kind of what we were aiming to do with the regulatory changes, what our process was, and where we are now, to give you a chance of full consideration prior to your vote.
Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the board. Mr. Chair, I am similarly an allergy sufferer, so it's possible that I will go on a sneezing jag at some point. So I appreciate the. empathy
I'm
for
loaded
that.
with cough drops up here, so if anyone needs them.
Thank you. Right to you because I will screw that up. I'm going to start, and Joy's going to talk a little bit about some of the more specifics that we've done, but I wanted to provide an overview of sort of the timeline. Some of you may remember that last June, we came to the board and made some discrete changes to the appeal portion of the financial assistance regulation. And when we made those changes, we indicated that that was just the beginning of the changes. And since then, as the commissioner alluded, we did an end-to-end review of the financial assistance system for early education and care. And with three overarching goals: increasing overall system efficiency, prioritizing the needs and experiences of our families, and modernizing and updating the overall system. So with the board's approval in December, in November, you got a robust presentation about some of what we were thinking. In December, you approved, and thank you for that, to send these regulations out for public comment. We very intentionally did an extended public comment period, knowing that these regulations would make such an impact on our providers, on our families' lives. We wanted to give people the opportunity to really engage with us, to and including scheduling a public forum with over 200 people participating. We received 40 comments. We got dozens of formal written comments, all of which, as the commissioner mentioned, made the regulations that are before the board today better, made the regulations more inclusive, easier to navigate, more readable, all those things that we want for our users. And at this point, we have incorporated that public comment, and we are at a point where we're ready for the board to ask the board to formally give us the authority to promulgate the regulations. And what that will mean is we will send them to the Secretary of State's office. They will be published in the Massachusetts Register and become the law of the land, so to speak. And we're looking at an effective date in a few months, because there is some really good and important work that Joy is going to talk a little bit about, to get the policies and the procedures aligned so that when these regulations are effective, all of our key stakeholders have the ability to know what they're doing, to know what to expect, so that it's as seamless a transition as possible. And with that, I'm happy to turn it over to my colleague, Joy, on this one.
Thanks, Janice.
You're welcome.
Hello, everybody. I want to start, I'm going to be very informal, and I would like to start by thanking you all for being thought partners with us. For some of you, it was a short time, and for some of you, it was about a year. And Commissioner, thank you for being our compass through this work. I would like to say on behalf of Rob Orthman, who could not be here today for very good reasons, and on behalf of Michael Kelleher, who also could not be here today for very good reasons, that we're very proud of the work that we've done, all of us, all of you, all of us together. And also to remind everybody that there's a whole lot more work to be done. And as we're looking forward, we're continuing to take a holistic approach to all of the work that we'll be doing to bring IT and family and provider focused materials and really intense training, planning for trainings and extensive communications and all of the things that, as Janice said, we need to put together in order to make sure that everybody who needs to know is knowledgeable about how to implement and operationalize all of these reforms that we believe are going to change the landscape in Massachusetts for families to access childcare that's affordable. So thank you, and roll up your sleeves because we have a lot of work to do.
Any questions from the board?
change the landscape? Is this?
Yeah.
What are you anticipating is I guess, some of the hardest changes to enact? And maybe context of how long the current regs have been in place, so I'm thinking probably a lot of people are used to the current way of operating, so. More color would be great.
So I think that I could answer in a couple of different ways. I think one of the ways that we need to approach this is, as with a lot of our regulations, a lot of regulatory reform, is there's a culture shift that needs to happen. And it's a culture shift in how we do our work, and it's a culture shift in why we do our work, that we're really in every nook and cranny of this work, approaching it to be family-centered and really focused on the family's journey and how we can remove barriers to access and facilitate access in a way that meets families where they are, and, as the commissioner mentioned, promotes economic mobility and sustainability for families. So really focusing on that culture shift will be huge. And a part of that is that some of us, meaning we and our partners, have been doing the work for a very long time. And so we're going to have to relearn how to do some of the work in new ways and work together with families to figure out how to best accomplish what we need to accomplish. That being said, I think the policies and procedures and the actual reg work is half of the work. Now we really need to roll up our sleeves and be intentional about what does this look like now in practice, and how can we make sure that we're not reintroducing barriers as we build out the system of now how do we do it. So I would say that's going to be, those are going to be a few of the smaller challenges.
And I just add very quickly, I think education, to kind of build on what Joy was saying, educating our partners out in the field about the types of documentation. One of the things that we've done is we've broadened the types of documentation that folks will be able to provide in order to receive financial assistance, making sure that our partners know exactly what is acceptable and what they can use, and that they don't need to stick to the 3 or 4 things that they're used to. So I think a robust communications and training plan is really going to be critical to the success of what's in this document. That's a whole bunch of legal jargon. It's taking that and translating it into the step-by-step procedures. As Joy said, that's where you roll up your sleeves and buckle up, because that is exactly what we need to do to make this work.
I'll just want to add two quick things to that. One is, we have 2 very important timely tools that we're going to be able to use to affect some of these changes. One is we have an RFR on the street right now for our child care resource and referral services, which is our voucher management system, really externally administered. And that gives us one really important tool to affect these changes. And so those contracts will be going into a place on July 1st. And we have an opportunity through that to really implement the new policies. Also, our contracts for child care financial assistance, which is about 170 contracts across the Commonwealth, nearly $400 million, somewhere 380. Still trying to land exactly on that number right now. Those contracts, we are underway in sort of initiating a reprocurement of that. We expect new contracts in place by January 1st. Those have not been reprocured since 2009. So that gives us another really important tool and vehicle for us to communicate the changes that we expect to be seen. The other thing, and this comes a little bit from my experience in some ways in other state agencies as well, is that when you simplify the processes, the change process is not as hard as when you add new things in. So I actually hope that by kind of tearing down some of the barriers and relieving some of the complications in the system, that the change process and the culture change that will need to happen will be simpler in some respects, because we'll be removing things that have to get done instead of adding additional layers. But
I think this is the first time, Joy, you would know better than I, that these regulations have been fully overhauled. Correct. Since their implementation. So I know that was one part of your question, was when is the last time something like this happened? There have been some discrete changes along the way, but this is the first sort of end-to-end overhaul that's happened.
which would have been since 2005. or
There was,
earlier.
there was a minor update, I think, around 2016.
Yeah.
But
But nothing like
Yeah.
this.
I think it's equally important to um, uh, educate the families. They're used to the old system as well. You know, many families have come up on the wait list and not able, not being able to get subsidies because they don't have the documentation that was required. Or they really face those barriers you are eliminating. So um, we should think about a campaign, or it would just a way to like a one pager to like distribute to all the families that are on the wait list, for example, so they can be ready and be more positive about the whole process. It hasn't been a positive process for every family, and we want to make sure that it's out there that their voice is being heard.
And that's, I think, what we tried to do even during the process for getting to where we are with these regulations is engage with the public and engage with anybody who could attend that, the public forum. And there were families who attended, there were providers who attended, because we really did want to make sure that we are casting this net far and wide, because anyone who's impacted, hearing their voice is going to make what we have in this paper and what ends up getting published and what the procedures and policies end up being, it makes them better.
And Maria, I'll add that very much we have intention to build out family-facing materials that are intended to empower families to have the information that they need to navigate, in addition to the supports that we'll be providing. So looking forward to building those out.
So I can imagine that the two of you are the most anxious for us to take this vote, but I am going to call a break, just because we have a little technical issue, and it really does have to do with the fact that this is a very significant regulation change, and a lot of engagement and work has gone into this, that I want to ensure that each board member has the opportunity to ask any questions and also vote on this. And so if it's okay with the board, I will call a 2-minute break so we can get our colleagues back on the line here to engage in this vote.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you. All right, welcome back. Before we move to the vote, I just want to ask the board if there are any final questions, comments for Janice and Joy.
Just one.
Yeah.
Yay.
No, I think you have to look at the record here to see the progress of this work. And so while I know we're spending, 10, 15 minutes on it today, this has been an ongoing kind of conversation for a number of meetings. And so just want to acknowledge that this is significant, to hear that this is the first major revision since maybe 2005. This is a big deal. And so I appreciate your comment too, that a lot of the work starts now once upon this vote. And so thank you both for your leadership and your team's leadership in getting us to this point.
Thank you.
And so I will make the motion that the Board of Early Education and Care, in accordance with General Law, Chapter 15D, Section 3F, having solicited public comment as required by General Law, Chapter 30A, hereby approves 606 CMR 10.00, the proposed amended regulations governing financial assistance for subsidized care, and authorizes the Commissioner of Early Education and Care to file the proposed amended regulations with Secretary of the Commonwealth for publication in the Massachusetts Register. Can I have a second?
Second.
Carolyn, second. I'll call the roll. Secretary Tutwiler.
Yes.
Maura Siegel.
Yes.
Carolyn Kane.
Yes.
Maria Moeller.
Yes.
Nikki Ruiz.
Yes.
Cheryl Travers.
Yes.
Jamela Lee.
Yes.
Stephanie Carrington. George Atanasoff.
Yes.
Linda Sager.
Yes.
Regulations are approved.
Thank you
I
so
just
much.
want to make one final comment. Oh, hello?
Those are missing yes, I think.
I just want to make one final comment, and that is thank you to the public who commented. Public comment to me is always in service of improving things. And it sounds like from the remarks of the commissioner, as well as the experience that you both had in your teams, that it did do just that. And so I want to thank those who participated in the process to get us to this point. This is what government does, is we engage with the public to make things better. And it sounds like we accomplished that. And so we look forward to hearing the progress on implementation now and the work ahead as we change that mindset going forward. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let's see, I'm going to invite Amy and Jocelyn and Teresa to please join us. And I will have them each introduce themselves as well and their roles. This is another big milestone for Massachusetts and for the agency. So we are very pleased to be able to present the next set of findings around our cost study around childcare financial assistance and childcare financial assistance rates. I'm going to provide a couple minutes of context and I'll turn it over to the team. For those of you who've been around with us for a long time, and then for those of you who are new, a significant portion of the agency's budget is in childcare financial assistance, nearly $800 million, which comes through the Child Care Development Block Grant. We spent some time over the last several months kind of taking a walk back, taking a look at child care financial assistance, what some of the context is. One of the rules governing the distribution of those funds for states is that every 3 years, the agency needs to do what's called a market rate survey. And that's to understand what the prices are that are being charged in the market for the purpose of families, us understanding what kind of access our child care financial assistance rates at the rate that we set, what kind of access that gives families in the market. There has been an increasing recognition by the federal government, by states across the Commonwealth, by this board, by EDC leadership over the years, that using price alone as a way to understand what the market conditions are for childcare and for family access is not enough. We know that the prices vary widely, and we spent some time in the fall looking at what those prices are. And so the importance of understanding the cost of delivering care has become increasingly important for us to understand the experience of our providers and the experience of access to care for families. So an increasing number of states have begun to supplement their market rate with cost studies to understand what the actual cost of care is. So we know from the work that we've done over the years that the price often doesn't meet the cost in most settings. And that is, you can't really turn a podcast on or open up the newspaper today and not hear about the child care market and sort of the basic failure in the market, that what families can pay, whether they're subsidized by us or paying privately, does not meet the cost of care. And this study will give us a lot more information about what the actual costs are so that we can use that information to inform our overall childcare financing strategy. So in addition to understanding how we might change rates, how we might adjust rates, what structure of rates we might use, the findings from this study, I think, will be much more broadly helpful for the agency as we think about the Commonwealth Cares for Children program, and as we think about what is really a stable financing strategy for early education and care that can deliver the kind of affordability, access, and equity that we want for families across the Commonwealth. So we've been saying we really want to use it to create a rate cost-informed study and a cost-informed set of rates. It is unlikely we would ever be able to set a rate at the actual cost of care, but we know that combining some of our revenue streams and thinking about how we support programs based on the research that you're going to hear about today. So I also want to talk just a little bit about the process, which is in the fall, we presented a very preliminary study, and you guys will review that briefly with you. This is much more in-depth, including engagement with our community partners and providers themselves to validate some of the findings in the work. Today, you're going to hear about the research itself and some recommendations that our researchers have made. We are then going to take that research and those recommendations and decide as an agency how to move forward with them. So we are not expecting or asking the board to take action or a vote today relative to the findings in this study. We will be producing a report by the end of June. So if there's additional feedback or comments that you have, there is room for us to be able to include that. But I also wanted to say that the findings that we'll be hearing about today, we'll be able to use them in a broad set of ways over the next months and years. Maybe most immediately, if we have the opportunity to implement a rate increase in FY24, we'll be able to use some of the findings from these to influence that as we think about the future of C3 and Commonwealth Cares and how we best structure that program. Understanding the cost that programs have in different scenarios will also be very important. So with that, I'm going to turn it over, I think, to Amy to provide a little bit of context.
Yeah, I was thinking maybe brief introductions first,
Oh,
and then
thank you,
I can
yes.
get going. So, hi, good afternoon, everyone. Amy Checkaway, Senior Associate Commissioner for Policy, Research, and Data Analytics. I'm going to turn it to Jocelyn, and then I'm going to introduce Dr. Teresa Hawley.
Good to be here today. Jocelyn Bound, Deputy Commissioner for Workforce Program Support and Innovation.
And so here with us today is our lead researcher from the Center for Early Learning Funding Equity, Dr. Teresa Hawley, who was also here before the board in September, as some of you remember. Dr. Hawley has over 30 years of experience in government and nonprofit administration, research, and policy. And is the executive director for the Center for Early Learning Funding Equity, otherwise known as CELFIE. So you may hear that today, which really focuses on, is a national academic-based think tank that helps to support equity in funding for the early education and care system. So with that, and Jocelyn, I'm going to have you do
If I
this
could
next.
just welcome Dr. Hawley. Thank you for being here. I do want to acknowledge and thank Amy and Jocelyn too before we get started. The presentation last fall led to some really robust discussions with the board. And so I just appreciate the team coming back to us to update us on that progress, and really looking forward to today, but also just want to welcome you back in front of us today.
Happy to be here. And for the board members who weren't here at the time, also, and we'll remind you about this a little bit, that the board directed us in November to come back in 6 months. I think we
I
said,
was trying to be nice.
I think we said a year, and somebody said, can you come back sooner? In 6 months with some specific directives to our researchers and Dr. Hawley, as well as the agency, in terms of coming back with sort of a next set of findings that we could hurry up and understand what the costs are so that we can begin to move the system forward with that set of information. So here, and we made it back. Indeed.
All right, so really honored to be here again to provide some context, pretty big picture context behind this research, just to lay the groundwork for the board and for those watching as well, about where we have been as an agency, and then Jocelyn's going to talk more about where we might be going. So briefly, just some context about federal expectations for states that is really relevant to this research. Again, that CELFIE is contracted with the EEC to carry out. And historically, the federal guidance to states has really been to focus, as the commissioner said, on comparing subsidy reimbursement rates to market prices or rates through a market rate survey, which really tells states the percentage of the overall childcare market that their childcare financial assistance system or subsidy reimbursement rates will allow participating families to access. The federal government considers the 75th percentile, as we talked about in the fall, as a really important benchmark for states to aim for, although it's not required, to understand, again, the extent to which subsidy rates are providing participating families with adequate access and choice within the early education and care market. 75th percentile, a helpful way, I think, for me to understand this is, in other words, that rates should be set to a level that would give families access to 3 out of every 4 available childcare slots or programs within their region, age group, and program type. So the 75th percentile indicates the rate that would meet or exceed the price for 75% of slots for different kids of different ages offered by providers. States are now also required to focus and report to the federal government on the costs to understand the extent to which their subsidy rates cover costs. And again, this is in recognition of the fact that the prices that parents pay in many cases do not align with the full cost of delivering early education and care services. So therefore, cost information really provides important information, again, in conjunction with understanding of rates to inform the setting of rates and really funding high-quality services for young children. States are currently required to conduct a more narrowly focused cost analysis, which is what was presented to the board this fall, at least every 3 years, again, to understand the extent to which rates cover the cost of care. States are not currently required, unless they opt to conduct a more comprehensive in-depth study, which is what Selfie is here to present today, which is what has been done over the past 6 months. Next slide, please. Thank you, Jocelyn. I'm not good at that part. Yeah, that's great. So this timeline just shows Massachusetts' recent history of conducting market rate surveys and recently also cost analyses from 2018 through today. We are at the star that is on the slide here, just to orient the board. The gray circles here are the last cycle of market rate surveys, again, for both the federal plan and also to inform rates here in Massachusetts from 2018 through federal fiscal year 2019, actually through 21. And then the blue circles here are the current cycle, which is federal fiscal year 2022 to 25. So EEC, just to orient everybody who is not here, contracted with a different research organization to conduct the 2018 market rate survey and a very, very limited cost analysis. And typically EEC would have conducted the next market rate survey in 2021, but due to the pandemic, an extension was granted to Massachusetts and 20 other states, I think as well, to 2022. So for the current federal cycle, again, in 2022, EEC contracted with Selfie to conduct the market rate survey and the preliminary cost analysis, or the more narrowly focused cost analysis for the current federal state plan. And this past September, the EEC board, all of you, was presented with the market rate survey and preliminary cost analysis findings. The final report was approved by the board in October. And in November, as I think Jocelyn's going to talk more about, the board approved a rate increase informed in part by the market rate survey findings, which was the point at which the board also directed EEC to proceed with the second phase of the more in-depth cost analysis, which we're here to talk about today. So just really quickly, this fiscal year, we intentionally organized the research into 2 phases. Again, phase 1 was the market rate survey and the updated preliminary cost analysis, which is already complete. And today we are here to talk about phase 2, which is the more in-depth cost research and cost modeling, which includes looking at current costs as well as looking at costs with different targets for both compensation and staffing. Next slide, please. So again, just to recap some of the 2022 market rate survey findings that were shared with the board in September. And I will remind the board that this market rate survey really included a more robust and representative sample than had been able to be attained in prior cycles, mostly in part or due to the C3 data that was available through this C3 grant that really helped, again, to ensure that a much higher percentage of providers were reporting than in the past. So I'm not going to read everything on this slide, but just to recap, the 2022 market rate survey found that in all regions of the Commonwealth, for every age group and for both center-based care and family child care, existing subsidy rates were below or are below the 75th percentile of the market rate, and in most cases also below the 50th percentile. This is important because subsidy rates are much lower than the rates a provider would charge to private pay families. So therefore, providers are likely less able or willing to serve families who are participating in the child care financial assistance system. States also reported at that time, and this is something that we report on to the federal government, providers reported on their participation in the subsidy system, as well as barriers to participation. And 60% of providers reported that they served kids with state financial assistance during the designated time period, which was 2020 to 2022 at that time. There's not an official benchmark for this, and I think we talked a little bit about this at the last board meeting as well, but in essence, a high percentage of providers need to accept subsidy for participating families to really be able to access the care of their choice. So I'm going to now turn it to Jocelyn to talk about, again, as a recap, the response to the market rate survey as well as the preliminary cost analysis.
So in response to the market rate survey, just as a starting place, and this is also a piece of our federal compliance as well, we reviewed all of our rates by region, by age group, and took the opportunity to use the rate reserve provided to us by the budget to increase rates. There was a historic 10% across the board increase for center-based programs. 8.5% of that was a quality add-on. The rest came from the rate reserve, as well as it allowed us a targeted increase. So we could look across all the different rates that we had available to us and bring all of those rates up to the 30th percentile of the market rate. We also provided a similar 10% across the board increase for FCC providers to similarly bring their rates up above the 30th percentile. And in addition, increased the daily add-on rate for supportive young parent and homeless contracts as well by $1. So really a lot of significant work done on our rates during this past rate increase. Looking at the preliminary cost study findings, so this is the phase 1 work that was responsive to the federal requirements, and these results were presented in the fall. The cost of providing care for infants and toddlers far exceeds the cost for preschool and school age children. I don't think that's surprising to hear, because infants and toddlers need many more adults in much smaller groups than preschoolers and school age do. Interestingly, we also found estimated costs for providing care did not vary substantially across geographies as much as the prices charged for care. So the rates varied a great deal across geographies. The costs did not vary as much. And this was one aspect of the cost study that we really wanted to take a close look at in the second pass and deeper dive into the cost work to really, understand from a few different perspectives the way that variation occurred. And finally, the extent to which rates met the preliminary cost estimates really varied by region and age group, again, driven by the differences in rates and the greater stability of the costs across regions. So looking ahead, we are here now in response to your request to come back in 6 months and provide further information about a deeper dive into the cost work. And Teresa will dig into that in just a few minutes. We are also committed to continue to consider both the market rate findings as well as the ongoing cost work and thinking about the current rate structure and revisions that we might make to the rate structure. And this could inform rate increases as well in the future to think about ways that we could change the overall structure. And we'll talk a little bit more about recommendations a little later. At the same time, we are moving into, as Amy mentioned, into the next cycle of conversation with our federal partners in informing them about the studies, the ongoing work that we're doing to understand our rates, how they're supporting families in both accessing care and also supporting programs and funding the care that they are providing. We have an opportunity to work with OCC to propose a methodology that's an alternative to the market rate study if we choose. I think we as an agency are committed to the fact that both the market rate and the cost analysis provide important and useful information. And over the next 6 months, we'll be working with OCC to come to a determination as to what methodology we will use for the next cycle. We will have to complete that work by June 30th of 2024, which is when our next state plan is due. And as part of that plan, we'll be telling our federal partners what our plan is for the methodology that we will use to set rates. And then going into fiscal year 25, we will have the opportunity to propose rate revisions using the methodology as proposed. So that's where we're going with this. But right now, we're ready to dig into the details of the cost work that was done. Turn it over to Teresa.
Well, I'm very excited to be here, and I just want to say, at Selfie have enjoyed so much working with the team at EEC. It's kind of a highlight of the week, being able to get on the call with them and really dig into the little details. It's very fun to have somebody else who actually is as nerdy as we are at Selfie and caring about all these little pieces of data. So it's been a fun project. This is our team here. We have worked in partnership with some other folks as we've done this work, the Children's Funding Project, who helped us do some of this modeling as well. And so it's, again, been a great project. I'm going to skip past our little executive summary here because that's just for you to come back and look at. So when we were here in September talking about the cost study that we had done, those were here, and we remember that we said, you know, there's a few things in this cost study, the way that we've done it, that we're just not that sure about. With like, we really wanted to underscore the preliminary in the way that we talked about the cost analysis then, because there were some things that were sort of poking out, being like, I don't know, this seems like that might be a little high, and this seems might be a little low. When you build one of these cost estimation models for early care and education, you are setting just dozens of parameters in a model, and all of them matter in terms of what you're going to get as your answer at the end of the day, especially when you're getting all the way down to dollars per day per child that you think that the system costs. And there were a lot of them that we wanted to dig into. And so we had the opportunity to use an incredible trove of data that the state had been able to collect through the C3 grants, especially the application process, that allowed us to dig in and look at every one of those parameters and say, are we setting this correctly? Does this really reflect what we think that needs to be? As a result, the model looks a fair amount different than it did in our preliminary cost study. The results came out to be not all that different because, you know, at the end of the day, it's kind of this is the care that you're providing. But this fine tuning that's been done here, I think, gives us a lot more confidence that we are reflecting the way that the early care and education market is really working, and the costs that are being encountered by people in the field. So we, you know, from phase 1 to phase 2, I think it really is a major upgrade here in what we've been able to put together. We've been talking about this whole prices and costs, right? So understanding that what are providers charging private pay families in the market, that is incredibly important. It remains important even when you understand what the costs are that providers are encountering. What we're able to do in this new study that we weren't able to do in the fall is go beyond the question of what is it costing people to provide these services today, to say, what would it cost if we were actually able to pay the kind of salaries that it's going to take to attract and retain a highly qualified workforce for our early care and education system? And if we were meeting all of the requirements that we have, not just by the letter of the law of the licensing regs, but experienced professionals know that kids and families need for us to serve them really well. So that kind of increased staffing. So we were able to do in this study to go beyond just today to what we need things to be for the future. So what did we look at as we tried to make this deeper dive and this closer look at the system? We were able to look at the C3 data. We were able to look at a lot of other data sources, and we were able to get a lot of good feedback from providers that helped us again fine-tune all of this work. So we use the C3 application data to understand a few key things about what are the programs in Massachusetts, what do they look like, and how are they operating. One important thing to look at is program size. So we know that there are economies of scale in early care and education. Larger programs probably cost a little bit less on average per kid to run than smaller programs do, because you have the out of classroom staff and all that kind of stuff. So we wanted to make sure that we were reflecting what was really happening in programs. So program size, we were able to get data on that. Staffing patterns was a huge one. We really wanted to dig into how are programs actually staffing the program. You can take a look at the licensing regs and you can say, oh, well, licensing regs say that you need one adult for every 10 children in the classroom. What we wanted to know was, how are people actually staffing that? You know, people don't have 8-hour days. They have 12-hour days that they're trying to staff. We tried to really look at how people are staffing things. And then last, what are people paying in the market right now? And we had great data from the C3 applications where people provided for us their highest and lowest salaries for various staff positions within the programs. So we had a level of data that I would say it may be the best in the country in terms of the number of providers that were participating in the data collection that we did, because we were able to do it as part of our administrative data collection for the C3 grants, which have incredibly high participation. So we also looked beyond just the data that we had about Illinois providers. There's a lot of national data that we consulted to make sure that we're, within the bounds of things. There's some things, there's something called the Provider Cost of Quality Calculator. It's a national tool. We use that to answer questions like, how much do office supplies cost for a childcare provider? We were able to use some of those sources. We were able to use some economic indicators. The HUD fair market housing cost was a key one that we used because it's available at the township level all across the Commonwealth. That helped us really to understand this differences in the cost of facilities, especially for family childcare homes. We don't think we reflected that very well in the preliminary cost analysis. We've done a much better job of that in the updated one. We were able to reflect healthcare a little more accurately as well. And then we did a lot of work on this idea of what do we think that people need to be making in order to have a competitive industry here to attract and retain staff, and used a lot of data to help us understand that. And then we took everything that we were putting together, our initial findings on all of this, and we tested it by going out and talking to real providers. So we had 9 listening sessions with over 160 participants, people from all over the Commonwealth. We had family childcare, school-age childcare, large programs, small programs. We did these in English and in Spanish, and heard a lot of the same things from folks. We heard a lot about in the wake of the pandemic, people are finding that they need to staff their programs more intensively in order to meet the needs of kids and families. We heard family childcare providers be like, hey, like I can't operate if I'm not completely full. I'm stretched to the limit financially. It's really hard to operate if I don't have a full caseload, as it were. We heard a lot of the pains of inflation, where rent, food costs, all of that is really important. And so we did everything we could to update to the latest minute possible of the costs that we were putting into all of these models. So we took all of that and we rebuilt from scratch the model itself. And the model itself really is just an Excel workbook. It's a complicated Excel workbook, but it builds out, like I said, dozens of variables that you can change and set all these different parameters, and then plots out across basically a model budget for a center or a family childcare home, with all sorts of things that you can change in it. So we have different staffing patterns that you can put in. We have our staffing pattern that we think is what people are typically doing now, our staffing pattern that we would have as our target, that folks are telling us they need to move to in order to be able to best serve kids and families. We're able to put in the salary data that we have now of what people are paying and what the target of all that is. All of this built out in a model that lets you look at the answers to all of these different questions, and that we're going to be leaving behind as a tool for the EEC staff, is an evergreen tool to be able to update this and collect information, put into that engine, and crank out the answers that we want to be able to see. So I've been kind of saying this already, but what did we change from phase 1 to phase 2? Number one, on staffing patterns on the center-based side, we learned from the data in the C3 data. And again, this is I think nation leading work here to be able to have this level of data about how people are staffing their programs. We learned that people are staffing their programs more with teacher qualified staff and many fewer assistants. So that flipped a little bit the way that we have the staffing pattern in our preliminary cost analysis. On the other hand, we learned that that just by reading the regs, you could get pretty confused about how many staff you need to have for some of your out of classroom stuff. We were able to find out what people were really doing. We had put in too many staff members in the preliminary staff analysis. Health insurance, we were able to kind of really consult a lot of data on for the Commonwealth on what the uptake rates are for health insurance so that we could adjust that instead of assuming that everybody was going to take full health insurance. That's not how it really works in a program. We were able to use data on occupancy, and this I think was important in our fall presentation. We talked about how we had what was really a very small adjustment from Western Mass to Boston of I think 6 or 7%. We said it was going to cost more for occupancy in Boston, than it would in Western Mass, which frankly it was just on the face of it bonkers, right? So we were able to get some much better data to give us a range of costs across the Commonwealth that are now reflecting in the model that we have now. So lots of different changes. Some push the costs up, some push the costs down, some change the cost differentially across the different regions of the state. Similarly for family childcare, in family childcare, we were able to use the connector care system to give us an estimate of cost of health insurance, for example. We were able to also peg the occupancy costs that we put into the model for family childcare to the HUD fair market rental rate. So we try to ground everything that we put, every single parameter in this, not to guess from the sky, but from real data that we had, either from what people were reporting to us in the C3 data or from other economic indicators that we had that were highly justified. So we're very proud of this study and think it does do a really good job of estimating costs. So we've been alluding to, we did 3 different scenarios on the center-based side to look at, one, what is it, the current staffing, the current reported salaries, that's scenario 1. What does it seem to be costing folks to run these programs now? Second, what if we actually increase the salaries to where we know, we suspect they need to go in order to attract and retain highly qualified staff? And then third, if we do that with the salaries, but we also increase the staffing to the levels that our programs are telling us that they need in the wake of the pandemic. All of this we put together, again, basically in a budget. Basically, we're putting together a model program budget. On the personnel side, that's really about the staffing pattern times the salaries for everybody, plus the benefits. On the non-personnel side, it's all the other kind of costs that you have, occupancy, food, supplies, all that kind of stuff. Personnel costs for a center-based program are usually 60 to 75% of the costs. The other costs are much smaller. And we put that all together to a total program cost. Now, we include in there a little bit of a reserve because we're not trying to say that we're trying to get exact. Any program needs to be able to build up some reserve. So we add that in there, and that is a standard practice for cost modeling across the country, and a little bit for an uncollectible allowance. So there's some parameters we put in there to try to make this as realistic as possible. And then we allocate all of those costs to the different age groups, and then divide by the number of kids that would be served, divided by the number of days a year. The model is built out to assume that a program would be about 85% full. So we're not dividing by all the possible children that could be served. We're dividing by what would be considered a good practice, well-run program number of kids that would be served. I talked about this a little bit already, but this is the different scenarios that we did here. At the license ratio, it really is based on what people are doing now. The increased compensation is the way we did the salary schedule, which we're going to talk about in a second. And then the best practices really came from our listening to folks in the field, where they reacted to our staffing patterns and said, no, in the wake of the pandemic, we really need these higher staffing intensities.
So identifying
Dr.
salary.
Hawley, I just
Yeah.
want to mention for some of the members that may be not as familiar with Massachusetts child care system, that we have among the highest and strongest licensing standards in the country. So our ratios in terms of what we expect from adults to kids in the classroom or adults to students are pretty high compared to other states. And it explains a little bit why it's so expensive. Everyone's always like, why is it so expensive to pay for childcare? And yet they're paid so low. And the answer is we need a lot of adults in the classroom to deliver the quality of care that we want. We need them to be skilled. And so that, I don't think anyone here would be interested in reducing those ratios, but it is the major cost driver.
Yes.
We already have really good ratios in terms of our comparative to other states. But I think most programs we talk to would say that's not enough adults in the classroom, especially right now, which is what drove sort of the scenarios where we want to start with our licensing standards, which are good and they are strong and they provide, a very strong foundation for health and safety, and build from there up to the salaries and additional staffing we might like to see.
May I actually just ask a question about that for the future? This is a request for the future.
Of course.
In the K-12 world, staffing ratios, have been found in research to not necessarily be the most important driver of the outcomes in K-12. So I'm just naming that to say, I'd like to learn more about the research behind the ratios
Early
in early childhood, just so we can understand the sort of the rationale behind it. I mean, it's sort of intuitive, but it would be helpful because certainly if we're looking at the research and we're discovering there's other opportunities, we should follow the research. So that might be a future request.
That's a great question, and we'll take it back and make sure, right, it should be as research informed about what contributes to quality in the classroom.
I'm sure we'll find that it is very important.
And that it has, but we may find other things as well. Right.
All right, so I mentioned the need to understand what kind of salaries we think would attract and retain a highly qualified workforce for early care and ed, which is so important because right now the field is facing a staffing shortage, not just here, but really across the country. And the assumptions behind that is that what's driving that is the low wages that are paid in the field. Childcare nationally is in the second percentile of all professions in terms of what people make. It is one of the lowest paid jobs in the country. And we recognize that can't be if we're going to be able to attract and retain people into the profession. So we did some work to lay out a target salary scale, we call it, that helps us have goals for where we think we need to go in terms of our the wages that folks would make. How did we do that? How did we set that up? Well, we have different positions within our early care and education system, director, lead teacher in a classroom, the assistant teachers in the classroom. What we tried to do was lay these out into this scale and anchor the top of the scale for the classroom staff to what folks make in the K-12 system as a teacher. So with comparable degrees. So the BA level teacher, whatever, we want to peg that to what folks are making as a BA level teacher within the K-12 system. On the lower end of the scale, the entry level part of the scale, we're tying that to a living wage. We have the MIT living wage indicator. We are able to then look at that across the different economic regions of the state and peg that lower end of the scale to that living wage. It's a little bit higher than the minimum wage. So it's tied to economic conditions. When we then take those model salaries and put them into the model, we adjust it up a little bit so that we give room for there to be a salary band, right? We wouldn't expect that everybody makes exactly the same salary. We understand that there's going to be a range based on experience, and how we account for that by bumping it up before we put it into the salary model, so that the midpoint is what we're trying to model in our program. And then, as I said, we did everything about this model we did in the 6 different regions of the Commonwealth so that we could cover all that variation. And this slide here shows you the difference between what we now see as the current wages that were in our current wage model and what are the targets that we developed for that position.
And Teresa, and just as a reminder, because these models and this whole phase of research is really complex, that all of these assumptions are for sort of, again, this current phase of the research and the sort of findings that will, again, be detailed in the report that Selfie will be producing. So these are the working assumptions, again, for discussion for this phase, which can be adjusted moving forward as well as everyone sees fit and as seems correct. So just to, again, sort of orient between, again, sort of this phase of the work and then subsequent thinking about what makes sense.
Yeah, and what we're finding nationally is that this is the process, right? You have to do some research to come together with a model salary scale that helps you understand your system, build that into your economic models like the cost model here, and then you are able to start making decisions about policy and about policy targets that you want to set. So these are sort of research targets that help us to understand the system better. So what does that all produce for us in terms of understanding the cost of the system? This slide here illustrates for you with infants, which obviously are a lot more expensive to serve than the preschool age children. It shows you the difference between that current staffing and wages and the with the higher salaries, and then with enhanced staffing and the higher salaries. So you can kind of see that spread across the different models for the different age groups. And then the report will have all of the results for all of the different regions and all the different age groups.
I just want to acknowledge, I appreciate this lens in which to look at this. I think we heard even from some testimony in the fall about a lot of center-based providers working kind of in this enhanced model, right? Even going above and beyond what the regulations require to provide for their population. And I do think as we look at, from a broader education lens, as more communities look at expanding UPK and the pool of teachers that we have to be aspirational about those targeted salary numbers, I think is the right way to look at it. So just a reflection as you're walking through that, just important to note.
This slide helps to see the difference between what we found in the fall and what we found in the spring. And again, the differences aren't large. We have on here the subsidy rate and then the cost analysis in the fall and the cost analysis that we've done now. As I said, some things push the prices or the cost overall down, some things pushed them up. We ended up with a little bit different numbers, but really not a lot different. They came out fairly close to where we had been before. But I will say, when you look at where the subsidy rates are relative to the cost of care, a few things that pop out to me as being a very familiar tune when you look at all of this nationally. One is that the cost for providing infant toddler care usually is a lot higher than what the rate would be. And that's because that's the way the market works for parents as well. You try to smooth out that cost. So that's not surprising that there would be that big a difference. I think the other thing that that pops out that's a very familiar tune is we're seeing that in states, the difference between the metro regions and the balance of the states, the more rural areas, that this problem that we have, that the feds have identified about trying to peg everything to prices that are being charged in the market versus pegging the cost, that has played out to be even more problematic in the less populated, less metro regions of the country. Why? Because there's a more compressed price range in those areas, and it's even less reflective of the costs that folks are encountering in those communities to provide care. So nothing about this is surprising. This is a very familiar tune. I work in Illinois a lot as well, and we have seen the same thing, that we have recognized that there's a lot of the focus on prices has really driven us to this little bit out of whackness of our rates relative to what the costs are for folks across different regions. So Massachusetts is not alone in recognizing that it needs to study this and figure out new ways to be able to set its rates.
Are we doing questions throughout or?
And
what's-
I'm
what's
fine
the
with
plan?
that. That's,
So if you go back to the slide before, if I'm doing my math right, and you look at the infant, the optimal daily cost for an infant in Region 6, 224, that's a $58,000 cost per year for that infant and 46,000 cost per year for Region 1. So I think that costs us out of the ability for anyone to be able to pay for that. So can you react to that? Like, even though this seems like kind of the right thing to do, it's also like, that just seems hard to imagine. So
it is hard to
it's like
imagine.
you'd pay
Yes.
$58,000, anyway, you probably want you could pay for a one-on-one for an infant for that. That's what, you're sort of got that pressure point in the market too, is your options outside of going to center-based care.
Which is why center-based programs never charge the full cost. They balance it out across the rates that they charge for all ages. So you can make a little bit more on the preschool and school age to supplement what you're bringing in from parent tuition. They're usually a little bit more expensive, but I guess I shouldn't ever say never, but it would be unusual to charge a family the full cost of serving their infant in a center-based context.
And this is not necessarily what is the full cost, it would be the full cost if they were, so
If they
this is
were-
the
yeah.
scenario of
Right.
the
More-
proper
of
staff,
more
and proper
staff,
compensation.
higher level.
More
Yes.
staff and higher wages. And so I'm just going to go back to what I said in the beginning about, I think, cost-informed work.
Yeah.
I think we can look at this and say, we're never going to be able to set.
And it's good to start with optimal, so is good.
What would
it's
the
helpful.
optimal
Yeah.
look like, and how do we use our understanding of that to inform the different way we support families to have access to the market and the different way that we support programs to have stable budgets?
But it also speaks too that we can't look at this in isolation from also thinking about like what's the program structure that needs to be in place to support it. The cost pressure of an infant-only program
Right.
would be much greater than a program that serves a range of
Yeah.
ages, for example.
Yeah, I'm just, and we can keep going, but struck by how interconnected this is. Like, you can't look at it in isolation. Like, I think about this, just the data piece. Like, we talk about C3 so much as, providing operational support, but it's also providing data that's informing another financing piece. And so, thank you to those who are filling out the survey, which may seem as though it might be an add-on to the C3, but it is actually sounds like it's informing a much broader body of work, which will help us figure out how many different levers to pull to get close to that. So I appreciate that point. It's not in isolation.
Well, and also, the other thing that it's making me think is, the early child care sector, the rise in pre-K is creating a lot of pressures on family child care and other centers that have to increasingly rely on their infant and toddler. So I think there's a question of our modeling out. It sounds like we'll be able to do that. How are things going to unfold in terms of the change of the dynamics of seats in the Commonwealth? Even what's been the last 5 years, what's the next 10 years? So is that going to be a part of this exercise, sort of understanding facts and projected facts around the impact pre-K?
Absolutely.
have.
And that's why it's important to be able to do this breaking out across ages of what the costs are. Certainly, there are examples out there of states or cities who expanded universal pre-K without thinking at first about what the impacts were going to be on the supply of infant and toddler care in their community, and found that it really did shut down a lot of access to infant and toddler care because they were breaking the business model that existed. So you have to be careful about that as you develop your
And I would just say this has been on my mind, Secretary, since I've been on the board, which is, to what degree are we designing for what I hope will be a rise in pre-K from the DESE side to the impact on this? So that's just something, I don't think we've really had a full conversation about that yet, at least since I've been on the board. So just naming it.
I would say it is deeply on the minds of our early education and care providers across the Commonwealth. And as more districts take a look at delivering additional UPK or pre-K and the models by which they choose to do that,
I think will be a conversation that this board wants to have, likely in collaboration with our colleagues in K-12.
Agreed.
Any other comments or questions at this point for the board? And then I think, Teresa, you have a couple more slides, and then we can also open up for questions. Anyone on the phone?
I just wanted to point out that while the salaries look, the target salaries may look high, you know, $33 an hour is $68,000 a year, which is still putting you under 50% AMI if you have a family of 4. So it's like, it's not, while it sounds like a lot, it's not. Like if you're living in a metropolitan area and like, you know, it's not, these aren't crazy salaries.
Yeah.
And, you know, I commend you for doing this work to talk about what would be better salaries, right? And I don't think that they're not ridiculous salaries is what I want to say, is that they're good. They're moving in the right direction. They're not, you know, they're not like taking great vacations and having big retirement savings kind of salaries, but they're sort of like getting people closer to like stability, which is, you know, great. In the direction we definitely want to move in. So.
Yeah, and I'll just add that, again, there's so much detail behind this, but for the increased compensation at the higher end, Selfie looked geographically, again, at target salaries. So it wasn't just a statewide assumption. They also made sure to adjust for actual compensation by region.
I was going to raise a similar point, Nikki, with the $68,000 a year is a $33 an hour salary, right? So we still have that same question about sort of why is it so expensive and the salaries are still yeah, maybe goes to your earlier question too about inputs in the classroom.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, the reality is that care is very expensive, whether it's care for young children or it's care for the elderly, or it's like that. It's a very person intensive and operation, and it can be expensive.
And I'm not bringing, you know, I don't want to bring issues without solutions, but just for further thoughts or maybe disclosures that, you know, I have to do some more thinking about how the regions are divided, you know, like what is the fairness of one region versus the other? And when sometimes you have two towns that are very different in the same region. So that's a huge level of complication, and I don't want to discuss that. You know, I don't think we have time to discuss that here, but I think it's good to keep in mind, as well as transportation logistics for families in certain cities and towns, you know, that adds to the cost or even access for parents. So there's a lot of things that I think that we need to list as disclosures and thoughts that need to.
We had the same questions as part of the research and did ask Selfie and Dr. Hawley and her team to take a look at the way the regions are, you know, they are an old structure that's not connected to economic factors or other drivers. And so part of the recommendations and what I think the board will have the opportunity to consider is not just the rates themselves, but the structure, including age groups. And we have more on that a little bit, but age groups and also regions and the meaning of them in terms of class.
That's great. And I wonder if DESE is already doing some differentiation across the state with regards to certain cities and towns or communities anyways.
Yeah, and all of this is, as much as I'm presenting it all as science, there's a lot of art to it as well. There's only so much clarity we get, because every program is a little different in what their cost factors and structures are. Whether it's by town or, you know, this one has got donated space, so like that makes it their cost a little bit less. Things vary quite a lot of how they are. So family childcare is a little different than doing a center-based budget. On a center-based budget, you have a staff, right? That you're going to pay that salary, no matter what happens, you're going to have to pay those salaries. You kind of build out that budget. It's a little different for a family childcare provider. The compensation for that family childcare provider really is the profit of that small business that they're running. So in this case, we're really looking at what is the revenue that they have for that program minus what are all their costs. And what do we consider as costs? Well, obviously the wages and benefits of any assistant that they have, and then the food and supplies and things like that, but also following the way the IRS does things, the business use of the home. So that it's things like rent and utilities, you multiply that by the time space usage of the home, which is usually about 30% for a family childcare home. So we include all of that to say like the revenue minus the cost, that's the compensation. And as we build a model for family childcare, we're kind of building it backwards, a little differently than we build it for the center. We were able to use a lot of the same kind of data from C3 and all of that to help build our model here for family childcare. But what we're doing with a family childcare is we put in a target compensation amount that we want to have to reach, and then we kind of subtract out the costs, the estimates of all the costs. And that gives us then what we would need to have be a per child amount that we need to charge. But it gets more complicated than that, because unlike in a center-based program where you can pretty much assume most people are following the licensing regs and having groups of 20 or groups of 7 or whatever it is that the regs allow them to have, in family childcare, the regs set you up as like having different models that you could choose. And so there's 3 dominant models that we have found in the data that we have. Again, so excited to have this level of data. We have that providers can do 6 children under 6, and only 2 of them can be under 2. Or they could do that and add another 2 school age children. So we have about 30% of providers that do just the 6 kids under 6, about 40% of providers who do the 8 children with just the family childcare provider, not any full-time assistant. And then you can have up to 10 children if you do have the assistant. And that's another about 30% of providers fall into that bucket. So what we actually did was design 3 different models and cost out the 3 different models and do weighted averages of all of those together. So
I think it's also really important with family childcare to mention that like how they structure their homes and they run their programs can be really varied. Do they run the program in their living space? Do they not run the program in their living space? Right? Like how are they structured and how do they set up their program? So I do think this is one of the first attempts at trying to do some family childcare modeling and costing out and recognizing. I think we originally thought, oh, could we just peg it to the center salaries? But no, we wanted to try and create a more tailored model. But I think it drives home the importance of us sort of using it to inform what we're doing, not saying like this is actually what it costs in family childcare, because they are so unique and each one runs in a very different way.
So again, we were able to put in all these different parameters that had all this different research that helped us to understand the costs here. What did we come out with? Well, if you remember when I talked about the center-based care, I talked about allocating cost to all the different age groups. In family childcare, that's a little more challenging because the way the licensing regs are written, so it's like you can have 6 children, and yes, only 2 of them can be under 2, but there's not a really good way of saying I should allocate more of the cost to the kids who are under 2 than the kids who are not. So we just have a birth to 5 cost that we came out with. What does it cost for kids birth to 5 to be served in these programs? This here shows you that then compared to the rates. And I do want to point out, like in Region 4, Region 4 is a really good example of the art here of what you would want to do. It has the infant under 2 rate being much higher than the over 2 rate. There could be good reason that you want to do that, even if our cost model is saying that we're averaging it out and saying this is what the cost is across birth to 5. Well, why? Because you probably do want your family childcare providers to be serving a lot of infants and toddlers, but they can only serve 2 kids under 2. So if you are setting your rates, for example, they set it the same across the board, you're going to unintentionally incentivize family childcare providers probably to serve all preschoolers or to serve, preschool in school age. You want to incentivize them to take the babies and toddlers that they can, and they can't take more than than 2 of them. So those are some of the reasons I say that it's as much art as it is science. You need this information about the cost. It helps you peg things. It helps you understand things. And then there's many other policy reasons that would come into play that help you understand how you want to set rates so that you are maximizing access to services for kids and families.
I just want to reiterate this point a little bit because the alternative view of looking at this data and what I hear from family child care providers often is if our ratio is 6, to 1 and a child turns 2, there's no reduction in cost, right? When you go from infant to toddler to preschool in a center-based program and you go from, 2 to 9, 2 adults to 9 kids to 2 adults to 20, that there's a legitimate cost drop we could imagine, even though I know 2 to 20 is not enough for a lot of programs. But in the family child care, that same rationale doesn't hold. Now, if you have a policy reason for having a higher rate for infant and toddlers, because you're trying to incentivize capacity in family child care, then that would make sense. But so the family child care specific data, I think, in addition to the regions, there may be an opportunity for us to really look at the way we are paying rates and do it in a way that might be simpler and more reflective of the care being delivered.
Right. And it gets to the idea that you're trying to do an overall financing strategy for early care and education that tries to get providers to a level of being whole. Economically, which is not always reducible to the child by child cost that you would be looking at. And the C3 strategy is a great example of that, of a different additional financing strategy that you can use.
Dr. Holly, I know we're going to move to recommendations and discussion. We're going to do a 5-minute break.
Love it.
So thank you all it'll also give us a chance to think about this a little bit as we go to recommendations and collective discussion on this topic, but we will take a 5-minute break.
Sounds great.
I know I'd like to welcome everybody back. Thank you for indulging us with a short break. And Teresa, thank you for that really robust presentation. And now would love to get to the recommendation piece of Selfie's work.
Great. All right, so we have a few recommendations for the department and the board to consider as we move forward here. I think what we're trying to move towards really is a whole country as an industry is to a more cost-informed understanding of how we do our financing policy, including our reimbursement rate structure for childcare subsidy. And some of the things that this study that we have done point out and show us is, one, there is an opportunity here to be a little simpler in our rate structure than what has evolved over the last 20 plus years in the state and in many states. Second, consistency is important. The cost modeling supports consistency in the way that you set your rates, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Third, we'll say it over and over again, it isn't just the cost data, it is also the market rate study that helps you to understand the whole market and how the whole financing structure is working. You should use them together. And then you should be thinking about reimbursement rates in conjunction with every other kind of financing that you do for early care and education, all the different sources. With your goal here is getting over time to meeting at the program level, especially, not necessarily, like I said, child by child, but at the program level, the cost of care with that increased staffing and compensation that we need to get to the best practices and to keep attracting and retaining a staff. So for simplifying the rate structure here, right now, the Massachusetts has 6 subsidy rate regions, and they vary pretty widely. I think there's as much as a 38% difference from the lowest to the highest rate. Our cost study doesn't show that big of a spread. Now, the cost study, the one that we've finished now, that we think is really, really accurate, shows a little more spread than the one that we showed in the fall, but still, it's on the order of 20% difference. A 20% spread does not justify 6 gradations across it, right? So there's an opportunity to think a little more simply here. this shows you a little bit of the data in terms of what people are currently paying on wages. And you can see, especially on the assistant wages, there's actually a lot of consistency across the state. There's a little more variation on the teacher wages, but again, not so huge that it justifies all that gradation in between. How do you think then about how many rates levels you ought to have? Well, there's a lot of ways to think about this. I will say, in Illinois, I know they really struggled with this as well, and are thinking about redesigning their the way that they break up the state and the way that they assign rates. So one way you want to think about this is are there geographic coherence considerations? Do you want to tie this to some other way that you're breaking up the state so that you don't get a confusing message for people? So that's one thing you might want to consider. You want to look at the economic data. What is the economic data telling you about how wide the variation is and who goes with what zone, as it were? We were able to provide a lot of data to the department on the HUD data on rent, on median household income, social vulnerability index, all these kind of things to try to see how does the state lump out, for lack of a better way of saying it. And it seems to us that the state kind of lumps out into 2 or 3 different levels. And it becomes a choice then of whether you want to go just to 2, whether you want to go to 3. There's probably a lot more thinking and discussion about that you want to do. And again, thinking about that in conjunction with whatever other financing strategies you're going to be doing and whether you're going to vary those by any factors like geography. So lots to think about there, but definitely an opportunity to be a little simpler in all of this. And then, you want to use the cost research to make sure that you're making an equitable system across your state. So there's a little illustration of some of the kind of research that we have done, and that will be in the report, and that will help inform the next steps in this process about thinking through how you might be able to create new levels, new structures for that. When it comes to consistency, this is, again, a very familiar story. We see the same thing in other states where if you start looking at the rates, because they've been chasing the prices in the markets by region, things can get really, and by age group and by type of care, things can get really out of whack where the cost data doesn't really support that. The cost says that, it costs this much more to serve infants than it does to serve preschoolers. And that ratio or whatever, that's about the same all across the state. There's not a lot of reason for this to be as different as it is across the board here. So one way to think about that is to make sure that you have consistency in the proportion of rates across the age groups. Always keeping in mind this reminder that the market behaves differently than the costs do. So the market smooths those prices, and as we've been talking about, because you just cannot charge people for infants what it really costs. People tend to make that up by charging more for the preschoolers and school agers. Again, smoothing that cost across the first 5 years of the kid's life for that family that's paying that. So again, you need to keep that in mind as you set your financing strategy moving forward. And I think this is one of our taglines at Selfie, is that you can't fix a market failure just by raising subsidy rates, that you really do have to have a financing strategy for your whole system that may involve things like C3 grants that you're thinking of as part of your financing strategy alongside your rate setting. The tools that we're going to be handing over to the department will help you over time to analyze whatever set of parameters you want. It's a very powerful toolbox that you'll have to be able to ask questions like, well, what if we changed the I don't know what if we changed our idea about whether we have more teachers and fewer aides, or we went to more aides and fewer teachers. If you want to just explore what impact those have. Or if there's a question of like, well, maybe despite all of our best research, people are not sure that we got the right occupancy cost for this. Well, we can ask questions and do sensitivity testing on this and say, what if we were wrong by a factor of 50% on how much it really costs for rent and utilities for center? How much impact does that actually have? The answer is very little. Because that's just not as big of a cost driver. But you can ask those kind of questions with a model like this. Or what about smaller centers versus really large centers? How much impact does that really have on the cost, and how should we be thinking about that as we design our policy? This tool allows you to do all of that and set all those different parameters. So what will be happening over the next 3 months as we finish up our contract with the department? We'll be finalizing all of these models, writing up a report. We will be doing some of those sensitivity analyses just to show things like, again, what is the impact if we assume something very different on rent, or what is the impact if we assume something very different on food costs or health insurance costs or something like that. That will be part of the report. We will be going back out to the folks that provided all that input to the model to explain to them a little more of the nitty gritty behind what was put into the model and how we responded to and included their feedback into the work that we did, and putting together a whole final report. And we'll be training the EEC staff on how to use this model and how to maintain it moving forward, so that, again, it becomes that evergreen tool that you can use. And that's that.
Thank you. You certainly left the team here with plenty of tools to guide our work, and appreciate the thoughtfulness that went into this. And before we let Teresa go, do you want to just open it up for any final questions before we hand it back over to Amy and Jocelyn? Of course, yeah.
The principle of simplicity and equity, they seem like they are potentially in tension with each other. And I'm wondering, because obviously to get to equity, you want to get to as individualized of an approach, but simplicity, or for example, in regions going to 2 or 3. So I'm just curious if you have some thoughts about how to think about the tension as we grapple with that going forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think it gets back to this issue of there's more than one tool in the toolbox, and in your financing strategy, you can think about different tools being able to be used different ways. I know Massachusetts has been a real leader nationwide in the C3 grants, for example, including the SVI weighting factor. It is an important tool to address equity and to help with your financing. And I know a lot of states kind of followed suit and said, hey, that was a great idea, and use that. So you may be able to use different parts of your funding architecture and strategy in different ways in order to be able to balance those. But I agree with you that, yeah, they are in tension.
Comments on the phone or other board members? Teresa, thank you.
I want to thank you too, Dr. Hawley, and it was fun for us too. I know we weren't always the easiest customer, but we really appreciated the opportunity to do this work with you and your team, and are really excited to take it to the next place. So thank you so much. It's going to make a big difference in how we deliver early education and care in Massachusetts.
That's what we're here for.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hawley. Now I'd like to, obviously the work that the team has done with Selfie was certainly informed or will be a helpful tool in informing us on how to move forward. And so we'd like to now hand it off to Jocelyn and Amy for some final thoughts about ways that we may move forward.
So pulling it all back together, although I think the discussion as we've gone has been really very productive and helpful in that as well. But, just pulling back and thinking about, what are we trying to accomplish with this cost information? It's really essential for us to consider as part of our rate setting, as we've talked about, but also as part of the larger thinking around an effective financing strategy for early ed and care. So if you think about a program's budget, on one side of the balance, you have the costs. On the other side, you have the revenue. We spent a lot of time thinking about costs. As we start thinking about our strategies, we're going to shift our attention to the revenue side. And we're looking at tuition as one significant and very important component of a program's revenue, which is either the tuition received by private pay families or the subsidies that come in to replace the private pay tuition and support families in accessing care. But there are other funding sources that we can consider too. C3 is an obvious one to think about. There are other grant programs that we run, and we can also think about understanding the different financing sources that programs use. And one thing that is great about the cost models that we're being provided is it does provide us a lens into both of these pieces. So we have the ability to adjust the parameters around the cost, but we also have the market rate information in the model as part of the revenue models. We have the subsidy rates. We can adjust revenue models as well and think about, how do these things balance out for different programs? And that's really the work that we need to be thinking about going forward is, sort of how do we piece all these pieces together and think about what are we doing with subsidy rates? How does that relate to what we're doing with C3? How does it relate to the sort of any UPK dynamics, for example, that are happening out in the field? Like all of these pieces need to be thought about together. And so that is the primary direction that we plan to go in using the tools that we have gotten from this work. Digging in a little bit more deeply, I just mentioned this, but this cost model will certainly help us inform ongoing C3 development, both in reviewing the current formula, evaluating the sufficiency of the current formula, and thinking about whether adjustments to that will be needed. It will inform future rate increases. I think we just heard a number of recommendations about how we might simplify, make more consistent our rates using this information. Certainly it's an opportunity to look to see, is there a floor that we need to bring up? Because the cost information is telling us something different than the rate information did in the last pass that we took. And also the opportunity to look at our regional rate structure and consider whether it's really warranted given the actual variation of costs on the ground versus what we currently see in our rates. So many conversations to be had going forward, but very, very happy to have the opportunity to share this with you and think about, where we might go with this information.
I'll just add that it's much more than an Excel spreadsheet that has been produced for us, as you can tell, because of the opportunity. There's so many, again, questions that this can help us better understand moving forward as an agency. So again, really appreciate and don't want to undersell this tool. Again, that seems very transformative potentially in terms of our ability to understand decision making, inform and understand decisions that we might be considering.
Questions for Jocelyn or Amy? Any questions on the phone?
Thoughts about other uses that we haven't considered that you want to enter into the discussion?
I mean, my comment, which I mentioned earlier, I just love how all these things are informing each other. And I'm sure, Amy, from your perspective as a data person, I know just being on this board for just 2 years, I feel like we have made leaps and bounds in the data world in a very short amount of time. And so, and you can see already the impact that it's having as it relates to the larger discussion on financing. And so just, continuing to figure out how all of these things interconnect to create what we're trying to do, which is trying to figure out how to provide for children across the Commonwealth in an equitable way. So. Any other questions, comments?
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank
you,
you.
Dr. Holly.
Great stuff.
For hosting us today, and do just want to make sure that we amplify one last time the presentation by Janice and Joy and the vote that was taken today, which really is a significant modernization of the regulations that guide much of the work around providing childcare financing. And so that was a very big vote. I hope we all feel good about that. Look forward to being updated from the team on the implementation and education for all stakeholders as we look to change that mindset that we talked about. And so did want to just lift that up one more time before I make a motion to adjourn. So I will make a motion to adjourn the meeting. Can I have a second?
Second.
Carolyn, second, and I'll call the roll to adjourned. Secretary Tutwiler.
Yes.
Morris Eagle.
Yes.
Carolyn Kane.
Yes.
Maria Moeller.
Yes.
Nikki Ruiz.
Yes.
Cheryl Travers.
Yes.
Jamela Lee.
Yes.
Stephanie Carrington. George Atanasoff.
Yes.
Linda Sager.
Yes.
And the meeting is adjourned. Enjoy the day.